At the start of the American Civil War, Confederate generals believed they understood exactly how Union armies fought. Most Union commanders moved cautiously. They avoided unnecessary risks, and when battles became costly, they almost always pulled back to reorganize. It was a predictable pattern. Confederate leaders relied on it, because if they could survive the first clash, they usually had time to recover, resupply, and prepare for the next engagement. But then, reports began arriving from the Western theater that described something different. A Union army was advancing deeper into Confederate territory, and even after difficult, bloody battles, it kept moving forward. These were not temporary advances. They were not isolated incidents. The same pattern kept appearing, and each report pointed to the same commander, a man who, at the time, many Confederate officers had barely even heard of. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Before we break down why Confederate generals eventually feared this man more than any other Union commander, take a moment to subscribe to Cloaked History, where we explore the real decisions, strategies, and turning points that shaped history. Because what made Grant dangerous was not how he started the war. It was what he became by the end of it. And by 1864, even Robert E. Lee began to understand that something had fundamentally changed. When the Civil War began in 1861, Ulysses S. Grant did not appear to be the kind of man who would determine the outcome of the conflict. He had graduated from West Point in 1843, ranking in the middle of his class. He had served with distinction during the Mexican-American War, where he distinguished himself under fire and developed a deep understanding of logistics and maneuver. But after leaving the Army in 1854, his life became uncertain and difficult. He struggled to find stable work. He tried farming on a small plot of land in Missouri, but the venture failed. He worked a series of odd jobs, including selling firewood on St. Louis street corners, just to support his wife, Julia, and their growing family. By the time the war started, Grant was working behind the counter at his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. There was little indication that he would soon command large armies. When he returned to military service, his early responsibilities were modest. He helped organize and train volunteer soldiers in Illinois, drilling men who had never held a rifle. He was assigned to operations in the Western Theater, far from the political attention focused on the Eastern states. Most national interest remained on the large Union armies forming near Washington, where many believed the war would be decided in a single climactic battle. But Grant approached the conflict differently. He did not wait for ideal conditions. He did not wait for perfect plans. He acted quickly when opportunities appeared, and once he began a campaign, he did not slow down. That approach became clear in early 1862 when Union leadership targeted two key Confederate defensive positions, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. These forts controlled critical river routes into the South, the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. Taking them would open the entire region to Union invasion and split Confederate defenses in the West. Grant attacked Fort Henry first in February of 1862, working closely with Union naval forces under Flag Officer Andrew Foote. The combination of infantry and ironclads proved decisive. The fort fell quickly, and its surrender opened the Tennessee River, allowing Union forces to move deeper into Confederate territory than ever before. And without delay, Grant advanced 11 miles east toward Fort Donelson. Fort Donelson was larger, stronger, and heavily defended by nearly 17,000 Confederate soldiers. Its earthwork sat on high ground overlooking the Cumberland River. Confederate commanders believed it could hold against any attack. But Grant moved quickly. He surrounded the fort before the Confederate defenders could react. His army fought through freezing winter conditions, with snow and ice covering the ground. When Confederate officers attempted to break out on February 15th, they initially succeeded in opening an escape route. But Grant rallied his troops and counterattacked, sealing the fort completely. That night, Confederate officers realized their position was hopeless. They sent a message to Grant asking for terms of surrender. Grant's reply was brief and became legendary. He wrote, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The Confederate garrison accepted those terms. More than 13,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, the largest surrender in American military history up to that point. In the North, Grant was suddenly a hero. Newspapers began calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant. His name was on everyone's lips. But in the South, Confederate generals began paying close attention. They noted how quickly he moved, how aggressively he acted, how little time he allowed his opponents to recover. Even so, many still believed he could be stopped. They assumed his aggressive style would eventually lead to a mistake, and that a strong counterattack would halt his progress, just as it had against other Union commanders. That assumption was tested in April 1862 at a place called Shiloh near the Tennessee River. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack against Grant's army early in the morning on April 6th. Many Union soldiers were still in their tents, eating breakfast, unprepared for battle. The Confederate assault was ferocious. It pushed Grant's army back toward the river, compressing them into a small perimeter. By the end of the first day, the Union position was desperate. Some officers believed retreat was the only option to avoid complete destruction. But Grant made a different decision. He stood beneath an oak tree, calmly smoking a cigar, and told his staff, "We'll lick them tomorrow." He remained on the battlefield, he held his position, and he waited for reinforcements. During the night, additional Union troops arrived, 25,000 fresh soldiers under General Don Carlos Buell. The following morning, Grant ordered a full counterattack. Union forces advanced across the battlefield, driving the Confederate army back. After hours of intense fighting, the Confederates withdrew to Corinth, Mississippi. The Battle of Shiloh resulted in nearly 24,000 casualties, more than all previous American wars combined. The scale of death shocked the nation. Grant faced harsh criticism in the North. Some leaders called for his removal, accusing him of being surprised and unprepared. But Confederate commanders noticed something far more important. Even after being surprised, even after nearly being defeated, Grant had not retreated. He had continued fighting, and he had won. One Confederate officer later wrote, "We expected Grant to fall back like the others, but he did not. He held his ground, and he attacked us the next day. That was when we knew he was different." After Shiloh, Grant was no longer seen as just another Union general. He was becoming someone who was difficult to defeat, even under the worst conditions. By this point, Confederate leaders believed they understood Grant's strengths and weaknesses. They had seen his willingness to take risks. They had seen him operate under pressure, and they believed those traits could eventually be used against him. But the next campaign would challenge that belief completely. Control of the Mississippi River was one of the most important strategic objectives of the war. It connected different regions of the Confederacy, allowing the movement of supplies, troops, and communication between the eastern and western states. The Union recognized that controlling the river would split the Confederacy in half. And the key to that control was the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was heavily fortified, built on high bluffs overlooking the river. Its defenses included miles of trenches, artillery batteries, and natural obstacles. Several previous Union attempts to capture it had failed, some ending in disaster. Confederate President Jefferson Davis called Vicksburg the nailhead that holds the Confederacy together. Grant chose a different approach. Instead of attacking directly from the north, the route that had failed before, he moved his army south along the west bank of the Mississippi River. In a bold and risky maneuver, he marched his troops through swamps and bayous, then crossed the river below the city at Bruinsburg. This was one of the most daring amphibious operations of the war. It required operating without secure supply lines deep inside enemy territory. But it allowed him to approach Vicksburg from a direction the Confederates did not expect. After crossing, Grant advanced inland. His army marched rapidly, living off the land and fighting 5 separate battles in just 17 days. They defeated Confederate forces at Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River. Each victory weakened the Confederate defenses around Vicksburg. Then, instead of launching repeated frontal assaults against the city's formidable defenses, Grant turned and surrounded Vicksburg entirely. The campaign became a siege. Union forces dug trenches and slowly advanced toward the Confederate lines. They cut off all supply routes into the city. Gunboats on the Mississippi River shelled the defenses. Day after day, week after week, conditions inside Vicksburg worsened. Food became scarce. Soldiers and civilians alike were reduced to eating mules, dogs, and rats. Residents dug caves into the hillsides to shelter from constant bombardment. One Confederate soldier wrote in his diary, "We are starving. We have no hope of relief. Grant has us completely encircled." On July 4, 1863, after 47 days of siege, the Confederate commander, General John Pemberton, surrendered. Nearly 30,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, the second massive surrender Grant had forced in just over a year. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River. The Confederacy was effectively split in two. The day after Vicksburg fell, the Confederate garrison at Port Hudson, Louisiana, also surrendered. The Mississippi River was now open from its source to the Gulf of Mexico. After Vicksburg, Grant's reputation was transformed. He was no longer viewed simply as an effective commander. He was now seen as one of the Union's most capable leaders, perhaps the most capable. And Confederate generals began to consider a disturbing possibility that Grant might not be able to be stopped at all. By 1864, the war in the Eastern Theater remained unresolved. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had defeated several Union armies, including McClellan, Pope, Burnside, and Hooker. Lee continued to pose a major threat, having invaded the North twice. President Abraham Lincoln needed a commander who could change the situation. He chose Grant. Grant was promoted to lieutenant general, a rank not held by anyone since George Washington, and placed in command of all Union armies. He traveled east and took direct command of the Army of the Potomac, the Union's largest and most celebrated army. He brought with him a strategy that differed from anything used before. Previous commanders had searched for a single decisive battle, one victory that would end the war in an afternoon. Grant understood that approach would not work against Lee. Lee was too skilled, his army too resilient. Instead, Grant intended to apply constant, unrelenting pressure to force Lee's army to fight again and again without time to recover or resupply. Grant wrote to Lincoln, "Whatever happens, there will be no turning back." The campaign that followed became known as the Overland Campaign. It began in early May 1864 in a dense, tangled forest called the Wilderness. The terrain was so thick that soldiers could barely see 50 feet. Fighting was brutal and chaotic. Fires broke out in the underbrush, trapping wounded men where they fell, and when the two armies clashed, neither could gain a clear advantage. Casualties were staggering, more than 17,000 Union soldiers in just 2 days. In earlier campaigns, a Union general would have withdrawn after such losses. That was what Lee expected. He believed Grant would retreat across the Rapidan River, just as his predecessors had done. But Grant did not withdraw. He ordered the army to move south, not backward. South. His men cheered when they heard the news. They had finally found a commander who would not retreat. The pattern repeated at Spotsylvania, where the fighting was so intense that soldiers described it as a human slaughterhouse. For nearly 2 weeks, the armies fought along a tangled line of earthworks. One section of the Confederate line became known as the Bloody Angle, where men fought hand-to-hand for 22 continuous hours in pouring rain. The pattern repeated at North Anna, where Grant outmaneuvered Lee and nearly trapped his army. The pattern repeated at Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered a frontal assault that resulted in heavy losses in a matter of hours. It was one of the most costly mistakes of his career. But even then, he did not retreat. Each battle brought more casualties. Each battle tested the Army's resolve. But Grant kept moving south. This approach forced Lee to remain on the defensive. It prevented his army from recovering between engagements. Grant was not trying to win a single battle. He was trying to wear down Lee's army over time, knowing that the Confederacy could not replace its losses as easily as the Union could. Every Confederate soldier who fell was irreplaceable. Eventually, the campaign shifted to Petersburg, a critical supply center for the Confederate capital of Richmond. Grant surrounded the city, and the fighting turned into a prolonged siege that would last 10 months. Month after month, Union forces tightened their grip. Trenches stretched for miles. Confederate supply lines were systematically cut. Resources became scarce. Lee's army, once the most formidable fighting force on the continent, began to weaken from hunger, exhaustion, and attrition. And Grant did not stop. In early 1865, Lee attempted one final maneuver. He abandoned Petersburg and Richmond, hoping to move west, link up with remaining Confederate forces under General Joseph Johnston, and continue the war. Grant anticipated the move. He acted quickly. Union forces pursued Lee's army relentlessly, marching day and night, cutting off escape routes and blocking the Confederate path. Within days, the Army of Northern Virginia was surrounded near a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's men were starving. They had no supplies, and there was no hope of reinforcements. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered. The Civil War was effectively over. So why did Confederate generals fear Ulysses S. Grant? It was not because he was the most brilliant strategist, though he was certainly a capable one. It was not because he won the largest battles, though he did. It was because he did not fight the war the way they expected. Confederate commanders had spent years learning how to defeat Union generals. They knew that most would retreat after heavy losses. They knew that most would pause to reorganize. They knew that most would hesitate when faced with difficult choices. They had built their entire strategy around these patterns. Grant did none of those things. He did not rely on isolated victories. He did not allow time for recovery. He applied continuous pressure, campaign after campaign, battle after battle, until his objective was achieved. Other commanders fought individual battles. Grant fought the war. And that persistence, that refusal to stop, ultimately determined the outcome of the conflict. One Confederate officer, writing after the war, explained it simply. We had become accustomed to Union generals who would fight until they suffered a repulse, then retreat. Grant was different. He fought until we could fight no more. What makes Grant's story worth remembering is not just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it. He was not a man of grand speeches or dramatic gestures. He was quiet, he was determined, he was unshakable, and he understood something that many of his predecessors did not. That war is not decided by a single moment of brilliance, but by who can endure the longest. Lincoln once said of Grant, when critics called for his removal after Shiloh, "I cannot spare this man, he fights." That simple statement captured everything. Grant fought, and when other generals would have stopped, he kept going. When situations seemed hopeless, he held his ground. When the war demanded more than anyone thought possible, he gave it. That is why Confederate generals feared him. That is why Robert E. Lee, who had defeated every Union commander sent against him, finally met his match. Because Grant did not stop. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe to Cloaked History. We explore the real decisions, strategies, and turning points that shape the world we live in today.